Okay, so this is Chapter 14, Behavioral Psychotherapy, our video lecture for Psych 4380, Clinical and Counseling Psychology. Okay, so let's talk about the origins of behavioral therapy. First of all, we need to know that behavioral psychotherapy are clinical applications of behavioral principles. So let's take a look at some of the history of those behavioral principles and some of the early founders of behaviorism. So some of Pavlov's work was a landmark research. Pavlov actually was a medical doctor who was investigating the digestive systems and doing research on dogs. He was interested in understanding how the salivary glands worked in conjunction with the digestive system. And by understanding research, animal research with dogs, he would be able to apply that understanding into humans and how our digestive system worked. And what he found was something that he was unexpectedly looking for, which is classical conditioning. We will take a look at each one of these a little bit later on as we move through the chapter. John Watson is very important as far as well as a leader in behaviorism. He had certain lessons that he learned from Pavlov, and he applied classical conditioning to human behavior. So he built upon Pavlov's original work. Then we have Thorndike, right? So Thorndike was important, and he founded the law of effect. And the law of effect tells us that all organisms will always pay attention to the consequences or the effects of their actions. It's part of what we do as organisms, regardless of the type of organism that you are, but particularly with human organisms, because we have cognition, and it separates us. Our cognition is theoretically far advanced compared to other animals on our planet Earth. And because of that, of our cognition and our ability to use reasoning and logic and certain intellectual properties, we pay attention to the effects or consequences of all of our actions. Then B.F. Skinner, he put into effect a mechanism by which the law of effect would actually influence behavior. And he called that operant conditioning. Again, we're going to look a lot more into that. So really, behaviorism evolved from basic research to applied forms of psychotherapy. So we're going to continue to understand these different behavioral approaches as we continue to talk about it, but understanding the foundation and some of the early founders of behaviorism is very important as we set the tone for the rest of this particular chapter. So let's take a look at the goals of behavioral therapy. The goals of behavioral therapy are absolutely based on empiricism. Well, what is empiricism? Empiricism is really the notion of using the scientific method. So really observing a phenomenon, for instance, paying attention to defining a specific target behavior. That's how it would be applied in behavioral therapy, right? So you observe a phenomenon, or in this case, when you're working with a client or with a mental health consumer, you define a problematic behavior and you define a target behavior. Once you do that, you develop a hypothesis, and you must have a testable hypothesis. So within a hypothesis that helps to explain the phenomenon, you establish a specific behavioral goal for treatment. So once you identified the target problem, then you're going to hypothesize and find and identify a goal that you can test to see whether or not it will work effectively in treatment. Then, of course, after you test the hypothesis, you can observe the outcome of the test. For instance, comparing the data that you received from the interventions and treatment to the actual goals. Did the outcomes work in relation to the treatment goals that were designed around the target behaviors? And then, of course, at times, once we're working in practice and using behavioral therapeutic techniques in a psychotherapeutic environment, sometimes we have to revise the hypotheses. Sometimes the target behavior worked, but maybe we didn't establish the right type of behavioral goals, or perhaps maybe our mental health consumer achieved those goals. So sometimes we have to restart the scientific process with a new hypothesis and maybe modify the treatment plan as needed. So it is definitely an ongoing process. Even though it's based on empiricism, when you're applying this in behavioral therapy, we understand that it could be an ongoing system where there's constant modifications that are happening within the therapeutic approach. So continuing on with the goals of behavioral therapy, really the first thing we're doing is defining problems behaviorally, because we understand that the client behaviors are the problem, right? That's the existing issue, is the problem. So of course we have to define those problems and identify the target behaviors. When we identify those target behaviors, we have to measure the effect of therapy. So our goal is to also not just identify the target behaviors, what is the problem, let's define it, identify target behaviors, but then then we need to be able to measure the effect of the therapy. Whatever therapeutic intervention we might be providing, we have to have it measurable. Well, what do we mean by measurable behaviors, right? We need to focus on things that we can measure. When we're looking at measurable behaviors, they should be something that is very specific. It is absolutely measurable. It is attainable. It is relevant, and it's typically always very time bound. Now, what's good about behavioral therapy is that the measures that we use are unambiguous. They're not like projective tests where there's these Rorschach ink blot tests that have a lot of different interpretations. When it comes to behavioral measures, it is very calculatedly measured and it is unambiguous. For instance, a lot of times we use behavioral interventions when we're working in the classroom, and perhaps we're working with a child with some hyperactivity. And so we want to calculate the number of times the child gets out of the seat. That is an unambiguous measure. We might have a behavioral checklist relating to how often the child gets out of the seat, and it literally is a tally mark or a checkoff each time that the child does that. So there's really no introspection that's happening within behavioral therapy. Behavioral therapists reject that, and they certainly do reject the medical model of psychopathology as well. So when we're talking about measurable behaviors, we're really not focusing on feelings and thoughts because these things cannot be directly observed or measured. These are just people's subjective experiences. So clients are asked to really focus on their behaviors and work with their therapists as a support system, as a facilitator, to help them to perform and to maybe correct certain behaviors, i.e. child might be needing to be helped with, how many times they get up out of their seat. And so then that means they start to work with the child on that. And the first thing they have to do is to do the intervention and to see, let's see if this therapeutic intervention has worked. Let's see if these behavioral modification has worked. And then you can measure how many times the child has gotten out of their seat after a 2-week intervention process. And actually, after that process, one more thing I want to add here is we are looking for observable changes. So for behavioral therapists, measuring therapy outcomes is really looking at observable changes, and those go hand in hand. So the therapeutic outcomes are going to be related to the actual behavioral changes. And so then back to our example, the number of times the child no longer is out of their seat could be a measure not only of the behavioral change, but also a measure of the effectiveness of the therapeutic intervention. Now, if the behavior modification doesn't seem to be effective because after 2 weeks the child is still getting out of their seat the same amount of time or even more amounts of time, then that's where we go back and we revise our hypotheses, revise our target goal, perhaps even revise our treatment intervention. Now, there are different types of conditioning processes where we can help to change a person's behavior, right? So there's 2 types of conditioning. The first one is classical conditioning. We mentioned that, again, was focused on Ivan Pavlov, who was a researcher trying to understand the digestive system, and he was using animal research to do that. But what he found was that every time he would walk into the lab and he had a bowl of food, he knew that the dogs would salivate because they were hungry, and here comes a bowl of food. And so what are dogs going to naturally do? They're going to salivate, right? But what Pavlov found is that sometimes he would walk into the room without any food, and guess what the dogs would do? They would just salivate. And then he started to realize, wait a minute, they only are supposed to salivate when I bring them food, but I don't have any food, and now they're salivating. So that got him to wonder and start to try to speculate about sort of these conditioned responses. So let's take a look at what Pavlov was interested in looking at. First of all, he knew that the food was the unconditioned stimulus, right? It's an unconditioned stimulus. It's there. It's food. A dog is going to have an unconditioned response. It's not something that you're conditioning to them. It's naturally occurring between a dog and his bowl of food. They're going to salivate. It's a natural occurring event. It's not trying to be conditioned. It happens organically. So the salivation that the food evokes is really an unconditioned response. It's naturally occurring in the environment. Now, what Pavlov started to notice, because he said, well, I'm like this neutral person. I didn't do it. I'm just, the researcher. So what he did was he applied a neutral stimulus, which was the sound of the bell. So when you look at a bell, it's just a neutral stimulus. If you have the bell by itself, or in this visual here, a whistle, and you blow that whistle, the dog is going to do nothing. He's going to have no response. He might look at you and say, why did you do that? But he's certainly not going to salivate. But during the conditioning process, if you pair the whistle or the bell, as Pavlov did, with the food, then you start getting, right, this pairing, this interesting pairing that happens, right? So the dog is going to salivate no matter what when he sees the food. But if you pair the food with a previously neutral stimulus, something that the dog wouldn't respond to, what starts to happen is a conditioned response. So a conditioned response would be, you get that bell or whistle and you blow it without the food present, and the dog will then salivate. So salivating in response to the bell is considered the conditioned response. Now, a couple of things that happened with classical conditioning. One of them is generalization. Generalization occurs when the conditioned response is evoked by the stimuli that are similar to, but not an exact match for the conditioned stimulus, right? So now the dog has like generalized that salivation that he originally had for the food now to the bell or the whistle. Now, discrimination is also important in classical conditioning because discrimination occurs when the conditioned response is not evoked by such a stimulus, okay? A couple of other things. Classical conditioning is considered passive learning because you have a number of variables that can influence the behavior and the outcomes, how many people are coming into the room, you know, what you're pairing the stimulus with. Does a neutral stimulus you think is neutral, maybe it does have some type of a response you weren't anticipating. Again, those notions of generalization and discrimination. The second type of conditioning is called operant conditioning. And operant conditioning tells us, you know, that an organism operates on the environment, right? And we already talked about this, about some of our earlier, right, founders of behaviorism, Thorndike, the law of effect. So let's bring that back here, right? So with operant conditioning, organisms notice, they pay attention that there's consequences to their behaviors, that there is some type of an effect or an outcome for every decision or behavior that they have. So they start to incorporate these consequences into decisions for future behaviors. And so that's where the operant conditioning comes into place, right? The notion that, you know, we constantly as organisms, we're scanning our environment, we notice the consequences of our behavior, and we start to incorporate those consequences or our learned behaviors into our decisions so that we can make better choices for future behaviors. This is considered an active style learning. It's much more of an active style learning than classical conditioning is, because operant conditioning, you know, you have a time, you have a place, the organism is paying attention. They may even take action and change their decisions and choices because of the consequences of that original behavior. Operant conditioning, under operant conditioning, all of our actions are governed by contingencies. In other words, something that we have access to, maybe even a punishment, maybe even a reward system, maybe an incentive, right? So there's changing contingencies. There's changing things that are going on in our environment that may alter our own behaviors, that may alter, right, the way that we're understanding the consequences of behavior. But behavior is, let's wrap this up, is a function of its consequences. Like everything that we do, we understand that there's these underlying consequences, and we've sort of like scanned them out a bit and have had some experiences to understand what those consequences are. It's an active style of learning, and our actions are governed by contingencies. We're going to learn a lot more about contingencies when we get into contingency management. Again, those are the three main components you need to understand about operant conditioning before we move forward. Okay, so there's different techniques based on these classical conditioning. We're going to come back to some ideas of operant conditioning. Remember, we have classical conditioning and operant conditioning. These are the two types of conditioning that happen within behavioral psychotherapy. These specific techniques that are based on classical conditioning are called exposure therapy. So let's talk a little bit of exposure therapy. The first thing we need to know and understand is that clinical psychologists' version of facing your fears is what exposure therapy is all about. So keep that in mind. time. It is most often used with different phobic disorders or phobias when a person has a specific, there's like a fear and aversive outcome to a specific stimulus, okay? So a phobia is a specific stimulus becomes paired with an aversive outcome, so you have these intense fears and anxieties and worries about a specific object or even situation or potential circumstance. So one type of exposure therapy is called graded exposure, imaginal exposure. And with imaginal exposure, a client never comes in contact with what is anxiety provoking, never get in contact with the specific object or circumstance, but they imagine the anxiety provoking event, but they're never really exposed to the real thing. So imaginal exposure. The goal here from the behavioral psychotherapist is to help the person to sort of overcome their fears. Again, to face your fears head on. And even if you imagine them, you can work through those imagined experiences and the fear and anxiety that comes with it. And you can talk about it. You can use relaxation techniques, and you can try to change the way that you behaviorally respond to those imagined exposures. Now, in vivo exposure is a little bit different than that. In vivo exposure is where the person can be exposed to real life items or even situations that produce the fear. In vivo meaning live. Graded exposures is different. A client and therapist collaboratively create an anxiety hierarchy. We're going to take a look at one of these on our next slides. But really, the graded exposure is starting at the lowest level of stimuli and the lowest level of fear and anxiety. And then the stimuli becomes much more intense. And along with that intensity of the stimuli also becomes an increased intensity of the fear or worry or anxiety response. And that stimuli are typically rated by the client on a scale of 0 to 100 in terms of the amount of distress or subjective distress that stimulus would produce. So again, we'll take a look at that in our next slide in more detail as far as the anxiety hierarchy that can be produced when you're using graded exposure. Flooding or implosion exposure happens, all at once rather than gradually. So graded exposure, so you're gradually increasing the exposure and the time and the stimuli intensity. However, with flooding or implosion, it's just brought at you immediately one time around. It doesn't happen gradually. It's just an intense implosion or flooding of the experience. Then we have exposure and response prevention. This particular type of therapeutic intervention has received a particularly strong, substantial empirical support for the treatment of OCD. And here the person would have graded exposure to the obsessive thoughts. So exposure and response prevention. So if you have an obsession, you don't have to have a compulsive response. Let's just expose you to the obsession. Let's think about the obsession, and then we'll work on then curtailing the compulsions that happen because of a result of the obsessions. Okay, I mentioned that anxiety hierarchy that happens with a graded and in vivo exposure experiences, because you can have graduated and in vivo experiences. For example, this is an anxiety hierarchy for graded in vivo exposure for fear of dogs. Notice here that you have the stimulus, which is hearing a dog bark in another room. That's low intensity, right? And the subjective distress on a scale of 0 to 100 is a 5. If we go to number 5, standing within 5 feet of a dog on leash, that, as you can see, starts to bring the intensity of it. And that person's subjective sense of fear standing within 5 feet of a dog on a leash is about a 45. Then we can go down to number 10. This is the most intense stimuli, petting a dog continuously for 3 minutes. This gives someone an intense measure of fear of a 95, where they would have intense distress. So this anxiety hierarchy would be put together between the therapist and the client or the mental health consumer, and they would work on this graded in vivo exposure and really just, let's hear a dog bark in the other room. And then tomorrow we're going to just look at a dog through a window, maybe even look at a dog in picture. This is in vivo, so through a window. Standing within 20 feet of a dog, then 10 feet of a dog, then arm's length, etc., till you get closer and closer and closer to the actual experience of interacting and engaging with the dog for a long period of time. So slowly, this kind of gradually exposes the person to the dog live, and they know what it is that has low fear to high intensity fear, and you gradually move through that process. And the goal is to eliminate the fears each time you achieve an accomplishment.